Good evening, good afternoon, good evening. We're in that sort of in-between time. Welcome to this Conservative Home event in partnership with Mastercard and the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth. Thank you all very much for coming. My name is Angus Wire. I'm the Commercial Director at Conservative Home. So thank you to everyone in the room for being here, and also for everyone who's following along via the app online as well. We'll have plenty of time later on for Q&A, and for those who are watching via the app, please do use Slido, and we'll take questions in from online as well. Small businesses are the backbone of our high streets. They are the linchpin. They are a kind of vital part of our local communities. They create millions of jobs, and they are obviously going to be a vital part of our economic recovery post-pandemic. The challenge is obviously very evident in that over the last 2 years, with people stuck largely at home, they've become very accustomed to quick, easy, online-based businesses. And so we're sort of looking at how we can ensure that businesses of all sizes get the support that they need, and that support varies a lot from business to business, and also how we can make use of technology and data to give everyone the best chance to thrive and give those businesses the best chance to thrive. So I'm very pleased to be joined today by Paul Scully, the MP and Minister for Small Business. So thank you, Paul, for coming along. To Payal Dalal from Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth, and to Ben Houchen as well down the end, who is the Mayor for the Tees Valley. So you're not here to hear from me, you are of course here to hear from these three. And it'd be great to hear from each of you a little bit from your perspective as to how we can support small businesses best, and then that will hopefully kickstart the conversation as we go through. So Paul, if we can start with you, please.
Thank you very much, Angus, and it's such a pleasure to be back all in person, isn't it? To see some of you. Normally, when we come to conference, there's people that I haven't seen from conference to conference. Actually, because of lockdown, I haven't seen some of you for about 18 months, 2 years. So it's lovely to be back here together, and I think that is the case for businesses as well up and down the country, especially some of the hardest pressed like hospitality and retail, where hospitality in particular, they base their entire business model on a warm welcome. So without people, without buzz, they struggle both ways, not just on an economic basis, but on that really community and social value that they offer our high streets. So we had to wrap our arms around the economy. We had to intervene to protect jobs, livelihoods, and businesses to the tune of 352 billion quid. Now, as I was saying to a group this morning, that I subscribe to the Ronnie Reagan 9 most feared words of the English language. I'm here from the government, and I'm here to help. So it's this idea that having intervened to that level, we now have 352 billion reasons why we've got to get the next stage right. We've got to get the recovery and building resilience into so many sectors absolutely right, because we've held the economy really tight, and when we let go, we've got to make sure that we carefully shape what falls. The insolvencies are at a 40-year low at the moment. Now, clearly, some of those businesses would naturally have gone bust and been wound up anyway, regardless of COVID. So there needs to be a return to equilibrium in that regard. But those businesses that have got a fundamentally good business model still, but if it was not for COVID, they're the ones that we need to make sure that we're supporting, that we're keeping those jobs and getting them to be able to bounce back better. And there's no doubt that within all of that, small businesses will play that huge recovery, as they always do. If you look back at the financial recovery after the crash in 2008, it was startups and small businesses that really powered through that. So what do we need to do as a government? We need to make sure that not only are we smoothing out those cliff edges that businesses face, whether it's business rates, and we have the fundamental business rates review that is due in the next few weeks in the autumn to really have a system, a business rates or equivalent system that matches the move towards digital, if you like, rather than looking at an analog type tax. It needs to have something that suits the 21st century economy far better and far more equitable. We need to make sure that people like Ben can continue to do the amazing work, and that we are actually helping him freeing him up to have more agility to support his local economy. When that local councils, the way that we've allowed easements for certain types of outdoor eating, for hospitality, for example, licensing and other things, can be made semi-permanent. We can keep that learning to make sure that we can support our high streets, not just big brands, but also independent stores as well, because that's what gives a community its vibrancy and what makes a high street a bit more of a destination rather than an identikit high street. And we need to remember the ecosystem of our businesses as well. So it's how can we encourage people back to the workplaces? How can we make sure that the hospitality sector and various other cultural offerings in each town and city feed into the retail and the smaller business landscape? These are all going to be very, very important for us to build on. But it's not just about the high street. There are new technologies, new forms of businesses coming on board. For a little while Nadeem Zahawi was out jabbing the nation, I took on the role of aerospace minister from him. We now have Lee Rowley coming in as a substantive replacement for Nadeem, who's taken that back. But what I saw in that time was the clusters of aerospace sector in the Midlands, in Northern Ireland, in the Southwest, around Bristol, and these kind of places, and indeed up in Scotland and the Northeast and Northwest. And automotive is very similar. But how can we work with the primes, with those big companies, British Aerospace and Spirit and Airbus and those kind of businesses, to make sure that they are looking after their supply chains, that we are also supporting those small businesses as well, because that helps the big companies become more efficient and more productive, and clearly it helps those SMEs as well. So there were two, I'll finish in a minute, but there's two schemes that we have launched, or one that we've launched and one that we are launching, the Help to Grow schemes, which you may have read about. Help to Grow management is something that effectively we're trying to introduce structured management techniques into the smallest of businesses, and that's effectively a mini MBA where government will pay 90% of the cost of doing that. And I used to run small businesses. I know what it's like. You work for your business because you're looking at survival, but you don't often work on your business. You don't often lift your head up. Help to Grow management will help 30,000 businesses over the next 3 years to do exactly that. And I want to make sure that we're pushing that into the harder to reach type of businesses where the productivity value added will be even more so. And finally, Help to Grow digital, which will help digital take up for the smallest of businesses as well, through advice, but also up to £5,000 off various productivity digital software as well. Those two measures will go a huge way to boosting SMEs, but also we want to make sure that business advice through the 38 growth hubs around the country is consistent, tailored for the local economy, but consistent, so that you should get the information that you want if you're looking to start up a small business. I'll leave it there because otherwise I'll witter on for another 45 minutes.
Thanks, Paul. And Payal, just from your perspective, and obviously the work that the Mastercard are doing around this, but how technology and data and kind of digital and building very much on that kind of digital aspect, how they can be used to help smallest businesses and back the businesses that need to thrive.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think digitization, I think we've seen as one of the outcomes of the pandemic, an acceleration of digitization, which I think for micro and small businesses, that's really good, and there's a lot of opportunity behind digitization. It can help micro and small businesses find new consumers, help optimize their businesses, and I think there is opportunity to use this new data to really understand a micro business in a different way. I think the challenge is that we haven't been necessarily recognizing that digitization has not been realized equally. I think the challenge is that there hasn't been inclusive digitization. And so I think that's the imperative now, is how can we ensure that every micro and small business can actually do well and succeed in the digital economy. And so I think there are a number of gaps that we've seen. One is that technology products tend to be built for more medium and larger businesses. And so there's a gap in the space for micro and small businesses. Second, there's been a proliferation of programs out there helping micro and small businesses, which is fantastic. But if you're a micro or small business owner, both my parents are, it's really hard to navigate all of these different options. And third, there is a gap on the capability side. So there is an imperative to gain the skills and to skill up. But I think the challenge, to be candid, is we put so much pressure on the micro and small business itself to embrace all of that. And so one of the opportunities, I think, as we're all sitting here as part of the kind of entrepreneurial ecosystem, is how can we actually shoulder some of that responsibility? And what I'd say kind of lastly is that we have to remember that digitization isn't just about buying and purchasing technology. There's a big difference between procurement and actual adoption. And so we have to really think about technology adoption in the context of behavior change and how we can actually drive that behavior change in a way that's quick and easy. Just two other points I wanted to build on from Minister Scully. One is this point around resilience. So I'm part of something called the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth. We're the philanthropic hub of Mastercard, the company. And we've been investing in micro and small businesses for over 8 years here in the UK, but also around the world. And we've always been oriented around growth as our primary outcome. What the pandemic showed us was that actually resilience is way more important right now. And so I just wanted to highlight the fact that we do need to think about financial resilience, but also mental and emotional resilience as we're thinking about how to help micro and small businesses. And I think digitization is one of the mechanisms to help achieve resilience, because I think we always have to remember it's not digitization for the sake of digitization. It's digitization for the sake of bolstering resilience and putting micro and small businesses back on the path to growth. And then the other point I just wanted to pick up on is this idea of the ecosystem. There is a massive entrepreneurial support ecosystem here in the UK, but the truth is it's really quite fragmented, and we're still operating in silos, which makes it really duplicative because we're all kind of repeating what each other is doing, but secondly, it makes it really complicated for micro and small businesses themselves. And so I think there's a real opportunity as we're thinking about how to build back better. How do we actually work more cohesively and collectively as an ecosystem to actually improve outcomes for micro and small businesses? So I'll leave it there, but just a few things I wanted to add to the dialogue.
Certainly lots to get into in the questions afterwards, I'm sure. And Ben, just from your perspective, I guess touching on some of what both Paul and Payal said around how those small businesses, the role that they play, both in kind of levelling up in terms of driving regional economies, local economies, obviously from your perspective in the Tees Valley, the role that those businesses can play in supporting growth and development in these areas.
Yeah, absolutely. We all know that the small and medium-sized enterprise sector is the thing that drives the backbone of our economy, which is why we've got the title on the Come Home Fringe. Those are the businesses that employ the vast majority of people. Those are the ones that are actually developing in the medium term the new innovative technologies. And actually, for every pound spent on a local business, the socioeconomic impact within that local region is amplified rather than with a large-scale company. So I think we're all here because we understand that SMEs need to play that role. I mean, I don't want to take up too much time. I'm much more interested in getting questions from everyone. There are some really simple things. Paul's been here himself as well. If you run your own business, there are a number of things that matter to you on a daily basis. I mean, one, have you got enough money to keep your business going? I mean, cash flow, cash is king. We all know that. Ultimately, that can come down to a number of things. Taxation of small businesses, both for startups and existing businesses. As we're coming out of COVID, we need to be very careful not to stop or stymie the bounce back that we're hopefully going to see, and we are starting to see as businesses recover. The elephant in the room or the conference centre this week, should we be putting up taxes? Absolutely not. Where we can, we need to do what we can to try and reduce those taxes, even if there are differential rates for maybe SME businesses or businesses that employ fewer than 20 people or have a turnover below a certain rate. We need to do something to stimulate that. We also need to do something about education. Skills is a really important piece here. One, because as people go through the education system, there is something about the education system that tends to leave out the entrepreneurial spirit that we see in the UK. So how can we see, how do people adopt as potentially a career, not just to go into banking or be a lawyer or go and work for Facebook, but actually setting up your own business? That is an option for people. I say that from Teesside's point of view because we do have, unfortunately, we've got some great statistics. We're leading the country and the world in certain areas, but in the UK we have one of the lowest startup rates of new businesses in the country. And I think there is part of that is part of the hangover of the old industries that we had. We had quite big, well, I say quite big, we had huge paternalistic businesses in ICI, in British Steel that employed tens of thousands of people. You can come up to Teesside and speak to, maybe the older generations, but they would say they would leave school at 16 without a qualification and they'd walk into British Steel, sit down in an interview with their dad's friend and the union rep, and they'd say, where does your dad work? He works at British Steel, right, you've got a job. And so there was this paternalistic attitude. And then even as things progressed with ICI, that it wasn't necessarily as draconian as that, they had the funds, for example, to be able to bus in students, put on away days, give on apprenticeships, being able to do some work experience. That, to be frank, any micro business or small business, I employed 30 people in my business. I didn't have the time, the money, the inclination to be able to provide anybody with work experience because you're just trying to keep your head above the parapet. So there's more that we could be doing on a skills basis. Something I've banged on about for years, which I still think we haven't necessarily gotten to the bottom of, and this requires buy-in from the private sector as well as the public sector, not Mastercard though, who are absolutely fantastic, but the banking system, certainly since the crash in 2008, we aren't seeing banks being able to support startups and small businesses in the way that they used to. We've moved away from the true relationship manager that could take credit decisions up to a certain level to be able to support a business that they knew, that they'd got to know, that they knew in their local community how it fit into that ecosystem. Now everything goes back to credit. And it doesn't matter how good a relationship manager thinks a business is, if it doesn't tick the boxes, it doesn't get funding. And we need the institutions, not to, we see what the mess gets us into in 2008 if we go too far one way, but it also does feel like we've gone too far the other way. And if there's things that we can do to encourage that, and which is where things like the new UK Infrastructure Bank is quite interesting, because is there a role for the public sector or in devolved areas that we're looking at in the Tees Valley? Is there a role that we can play to fill the gap in the market? Can we provide loans? Can we provide equity into startups? Why shouldn't we be speculating on our local economy to be able to give people a chance and ultimately potentially get the public sector to generate a return as well? We've got to be, I think, a bit more ingenious in the way that we provide public funding into grants and support for small businesses, because at the minute, what actually happens, you look at things like the British Business Bank, you look at things like things like the Jeremy funds that were in Newcastle. We've got various funds in the north of England, and you find that they then get outsourced to good fund managers who are very good at what they do, but they apply the same metrics as any high street lender. And that's not the place that the public sector should be interacting with. It should be looking at the failures and hopefully showing and demonstrating to the private sector that there is a gap that the private sector should be filling if the public sector can demonstrate a role. There are all sorts of other things about reshoring and procurement that we could get into where the public sector could facilitate. But again, the other part is talking about the tech conversation, is how do you get businesses, and medium-sized businesses obviously go up to a significant number of employees. There's been a bit of a schizophrenia within government policy thinking for a number of years where we want to increase job creation, and rightly so, but at the same time we talk about productivity and we want to move towards automation. Now, those two things can't necessarily go hand in hand on day one, so you've got to manage that transition. And it's one of the things that the Prime Minister is talking about this week, as we move away from things like uncontrolled immigration. We need to also be a critical friend to business to say, you need to start looking into how you automate some of your process. How do you make yourself more competitive, more efficient, not just on a UK or a regional level, but on a global scale as well, because we've got amazing SMEs that export around the globe. So it's a multifaceted thing. But I do think there are some big opportunities. Ultimately, I've just set out there for the last 5 minutes all the problems without any of the solutions. But that's what I do. I'm a politician. Maybe some of the people in the audience have the answers.
Hopefully we can start getting some solutions. But I think pulling out some of those points we've covered off there, and I think probably first one for you, Paul. But just thinking about Ben obviously talked about taxes and kind of possibility of kind of different rates and things for SMEs and how we can support businesses from a government perspective. And I guess there's this real sense at the moment, as I sort of said in the introduction, where you've got the SMEs, the high street feels like it's really under pressure and increasingly under threat from people moving more online. How can we make sure that we're bringing SMEs into that space, but also more importantly, how do we level that playing field? How do we ensure that they're competing on the same basis and they don't have necessarily the loopholes that some of the bigger corporate giants might have?
Yeah, I think you talked about high streets. I think the risk is that you go to just simply some of the digital taxes, the online taxes that have been talked about and mooted without looking at the whole holistic view on taxation. If you remember back in 2010, we had George Osborne set up the Office of Tax Simplification. Our tax code, as far as I know, is longer than it has ever been. And I think actually we need to get back to some simplification rather than necessarily adding layer upon layer, because otherwise you're just playing whack-a-mole with the tax system, unless you look at the whole gamut. But I think this is where, if you look at the issues that face businesses on the high street in particular, it's rent and rates are the two biggest fixed costs that the business have got. There needs to be a recalibration. It's happening naturally in some areas, but not quickly enough between landlord and tenant, and that's why we're talking about looking again at the landlord and tenant relationship and act. But similarly, as I said, I talked about the fundamental business rates review, which is due in the autumn, where it does need to be fundamental. It needs to actually have a better connection rather than just judging a business on its square footage, on its turnover and profit. It needs to have a better connection to the local authority. I'm the Minister for London, and the amount of business rates that are raised in the centre of London, I can't remember, it's some ridiculous percentage of the entire business rates around the country, and that's then redistributed around the country, which is fine in itself, but actually you lose the connection between the local authority and those local businesses as a result of that, because they're just passing on the costs. So how can you have a 21st century tax system that actually better connects local authorities and mayors like Ben to those businesses? So there's a better collaboration going.
Sure. And Payal, I know you talk quite a lot about digitalisation, and I think that's obviously one of the key themes to today. And one of the questions we actually had through on here is just around, within digitalisation specifically, how can we support small businesses to develop apps, develop software, develop the tech to enable them to attract more customers, but crucially for them to be able to attract their data? Because ultimately for businesses, that's the crucial thing. And obviously the big online companies are able to do that very well and very easily, and they do. But how can we make sure some of those SMEs are also able to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there is a massive opportunity here to help micro and small businesses better understand the sector they're operating in, their customer base, and I do think aggregated anonymized data is going to be really important here. But what I'd say, Angus, is before we can even get to the power of big data, we have to take a step back and recognize that actually, when you're talking about digitization from a micro business level, we're talking about things like setting up an online presence or migrating your customer relationship management system online. So we actually have to think about the different various starting points that micro businesses face. Now, the segment that I really focused on are micro and small. So usually businesses that are 10 employees and below. And so I think it's great to talk about the opportunities of big data, but I think we actually have to start a little bit earlier than that to recognize that actually digitization hasn't been widely realized. Micro businesses are one segment that haven't fully been able to realize the opportunity. Second are minority ethnic businesses. I've seen a lot of data to show that minority ethnic businesses have had real challenges adopting technology. And part of that is an access to finance issue that Ben touched on. And third, we've seen a lot of challenges around technology adoption for women entrepreneurs. And so again, I think the challenge with these kinds of conversations is we tend to oversimplify. I think the key here is that micro, small, and medium businesses, they're not a monolith. And you can't even say that all small businesses are facing this, all micro businesses are facing this. So I think the first thing that we really need to think about as an ecosystem is how do we actually understand this segment in a much more sophisticated way, so that we can really unpack what they need. Because as Ben said, they have real cash poverty. Cash flow is a real issue. The other thing, which I alluded to previously, is there's real time poverty, especially if you're thinking about micro businesses between 10 and below in terms of employees. And so that's how I would reframe the question, is to say, actually, there are different starting points of digitization, and we have to get the basics and the fundamentals right before we can even think about how do we create super apps that are going to help simplify data analytics and data science for micro businesses.
Sure, and I think one of the other things that you touched on, Ben, and this is probably the point where I start pushing you for the solutions to the problems you've identified, but just that point that you said about we have all this entrepreneurial spirit and it's there, but the skills, the experience, the opportunities aren't necessarily, it doesn't match up, and so people can't necessarily get that work experience. They can't get into those placements. That we need them to develop the skills to become the business leaders of tomorrow. Obviously, thinking very much with the levelling up agenda, the background of this. How do we solve that? How do we give young people, or not even just young people, but thinking perhaps more specifically about young people, the skills to become the business leaders of tomorrow? So
I'm going to use my prerogative to just also answer what Payal was saying as well. I'll add to it a couple of really good examples. That we obviously talk about tech and digital a lot, but you're absolutely right. I mean, I can give you examples in Teesside where we've helped support the funding of a website for a guy who wants to set up his own food vending business in the back of a truck. And the fact that he was having to do that via Facebook Messenger on a Facebook page is just bizarre. So, but he's also starting up a brand new business. He just left a job, has no capital, was trying to do it during COVID. And there are ways in which we can support by getting him a basic website that also allows an order function as well. And what's interesting, if you can do it properly from the public sector, and this is where devolution can absolutely help, you can then also match them with a local web developer. And that web developer might also be a micro business employing 5 or 10 people max. And you can also then pair them and say, well, actually, do you need some financial advice about how to set up your business? Do you need some legal advice with some of your terms and conditions on your website? We can, again, introduce you to an ecosystem of small businesses. And we do that very successfully in the Tees Valley. There's more that we could be doing. And then when you get through to technology and automation, you're not just talking about websites and computers. I mean, another fantastic business, a new distillery, gin distillery in Yarm, fantastic. You should try it out. I bought some of it myself just at the weekend. Bottling gin and putting labels on it. Somebody sat there every night putting a label on a bottle of gin, stamping the cork on the top. Actually getting the money to be able to invest in the machinery is automation and helping save time. So there are ways in which we can intervene. On the broader question, so I'll go back to what you actually asked me, Angus, so thank you for giving me that time. There's a real issue here that I think devolution and English devolution, which hopefully we'll see in the levelling up white paper this year, will help us address, is bringing together local economies in the business sector and trying to have an organisation that has a level of understanding and control to whatever extent on the education sector as well. And that's not to micromanage academies, institutions, FE, colleges, etc. But it's about helping businesses understand education, what an education establishment can actually do, what they can't do, what they get funding for, what they don't get funding for. But also vice versa, if you can give a level of devolution on skills funding, then you can say to your FE colleges, you can say to maybe not universities because they'll be funded differently, but certainly FE colleges, there are ways in which we want you to fund these courses more than other courses. Because at the minute, the way that FE funding just works at the moment, they get paid on getting bums on seats, not necessarily the outcomes for the student, and certainly not necessarily the outcomes for the local economy. Now, a lot of that is the way that the funding is managed, which is above my pay grade, but also some of it is also relationship-based, and it's part of that ecosystem that has been discussed. So I can say this, a lot of my family are involved in teaching, have been teachers for a lot of years. Most of them, that's all they've ever done. And they've never run a business, they've never been in the private sector and understand how an SME works, never mind a micro business or a startup. And they're there to teach a curriculum, they're there to help a student through. And if you try and put them in front of a business and say, right, now help them meet their educational needs for the skills that they need in their business, whether it's a startup or a medium-sized business, they wouldn't even know where to start. And at the same time, business, let's be honest, are exactly the same. Business don't really understand how to interact with education. Certainly FE colleges that aren't particularly friendly to engage with and really kind of smooth to interact with as a private business when you're time poor and cash poor to be able to run the business. And that issue is accentuated even more when you get into tech. I mean, the colleges, we've got 5 colleges in the Tees Valley. Every single one of them are pretty open about saying it's almost impossible for us to teach any sort of technological course because the technology and the way that the coding and the software is being developed as quickly as it is, it's out of date by the time you've designed a course and got it accredited and can put it on. So I think there's more that we can be doing with industry, and through devolution, if you can get some of the private sector, certainly the bigger employers, to take up some of that slack, create academies, like for example in a different sector, GE, building an offshore wind blade factory, blades of the next generation, 2,000 jobs are going to be created in Teesside. You cannot give the FEs the job of skilling the 2,000 people that are going to be employed in that factory. I'm sorry, it's just not going to work. And they recognise that. So now they're talking to us about how do we help through the adult education budget, which we do have control over. How do we help them fund the setting up of an academy that they run? And they work with the colleges to accredit, but they design the courses that are accredited. And I think what we need is education to come a little bit more this way, but we need business to come a little bit more this way. And we need to get back to a more micro version of what I talked about, where ICI could bus kids in from all over the place because of the big balance sheet. How do we create a more agile version of that, where business get what they need, education can help them deliver that, and ultimately the student and the person that wants to reskill can get a life and a career that can support them and their family.
But I think just building on that, do you think there's certain advantages for business owners, startups that are located in certain areas versus others? So without wanting to pit the two of you against each other, do you think, if you're trying to set up a business in London, is that easier or harder? Do you have more access to or more competition in that market, or are you able to do that more easily, more readily in the Tees Valley, whereas perhaps a different sense and a less
in the
competitive?
Tees Valley, there's a couple of interesting dynamics to it. So one, for certain types of businesses, land availability and costs of commercial office space or industrial space is significantly lower in the south of England. That's why we're seeing a huge amount of investment in large-scale logistics sheds in the north of England, because of that cost, for the capital cost of building. So there's an incentive. To do that there. You've also, quite frankly, at the moment, you've got a cost of labour issue as well. So, like I said, the average wage in the Tees Valley, £24,000. That's the average wage. So you can pick up good quality warehouse staff, good quality construction men and women, significantly below than you might be able to source elsewhere in the country. We've also got, for energy generation projects, which I know is slightly larger scale, you've got better connectivity to the grid. So where you're looking at some more innovative stuff that requires green energy, you've got more connectivity. And then the big thing we've got in Teesside, which is the biggest in the UK, I'm pleased to say, is the Freeport. And I mean, I also find it slightly strange that we've just increased national insurance contributions, but one of the big wins of the free ports that we have in the UK is the abolition of employers' national insurance contributions for 3 years, which absolutely helped deliver GE to Teesside. The two, I mean, they've been pretty open about it, to be fair. The two reasons GE are building that factory in Teesside, one, well, it's all because of the free port, but the two benefits were, one, the abolition of employers' national insurance contribution for 3 years. You're going to employ 2,000 staff. That's a big number over a 3-year period. And the abolition of business rates for 5 years. That's an even bigger number on a 1 million square foot shed. Now, that should say something to us. That's at the big end, but the same impact is at the small end. Business rates, employers' cost of taxation, employer cost to run a business. Those are the things that are going to make a difference. The problem we face in the Tees Valley is one of private capital, interestingly enough. So you've got the traditional banks, you've got some of the lenders. We don't really have much PE, VC. We don't have many of the big infrastructure funds that are looking our way. That's starting to change now. The government are talking about levelling up, highlighting places like Teesside. So those that would never get outside of the M25 are now coming to visit us sometimes. But the access to capital that you have, and that's not just for big construction projects, it's not for the stuff that we're doing, but if you're getting spin-outs from Durham or Teesside University, if you've got VCs that are set up in the region, they're likely to look at some of these technologies, set up incubators, help them spin out. We don't have any of that in the region at the minute, and that's a big inhibitor for those startup issues that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, it's not of them or us. It's not Northeast versus London. As Ben said, actually, it's probably easier and better to set up particular sectors in Tees Valley. It's other sectors. It's more suited to London. It really does depend on that sort of stuff. But actually, the barriers are the same. There's clearly an access to finance issue in the northeast, which we need to do more on. And some of the regional funds that the British Bank have been doing are starting to address that. But actually, we do need to take the diversity of finance more seriously as well, too, because not everything is about just standardised lending. It's about different forms of financial support for companies. But there's a wider issue around some of the barriers to entrepreneurship as well that can reach into female entrepreneurs, as Payal was saying, and ethnic minority-led businesses, young people, disabled people. And what I found is that the barriers are actually very similar in all those. The answers are really hugely different. It is access to finance. Alison Rose, the chief executive of NatWest, did a review on this and came up with a number of recommendations. I co-chaired the Rose Review board with her on that to try and make sure that we are getting a diversity of investment teams and diversity of thinking to actually invest more in female-led businesses. It's also about access to infrastructure. We've talked a little bit about infrastructure, but peer-to-peer networking and mentoring as well. That's not just Richard Branson at the end of the phone. It's actually someone that's maybe a couple of years ahead of you, that's maybe just opened that first shop, opened that first, taken on your first employee, or diversified. Because one of the things that energises me most about this job is when I talk to small businesses and about how they've pivoted. They may be, found in COVID. I'll speak to a small business at one point in this last 18 months, and they might be absolutely desperate. The following week, they've actually found a solution to their issue. They're agile, they're nimble. That's what's so exciting about small businesses. They've run out of road in one project and they've found another road, or they've actually just found a more prosperous sort of road anyway. I remember when I was running a small public affairs company, we were winning business from the number 1 and number 3 in the world, where we had 1,000 employees between each. There was just me and my business partner running from my kitchen table. When we were paid by check, we used to get paid by check. We would did a little dance around the check. That's that kind of mentality. And that
you got it on your wall as well.
No, I definitely cashed it in. As you started by saying, cash is king. But one interesting thing about the flexibility, because you talked about the big stuff that you're doing in the free ports. Small thing that I heard about just recently is Westminster Council. Some of you may have heard of the 100 Club in Oxford Street. It's hosted so many amazing bands over the years. It's been going for something like 60, 70 years. And it's been really struggling, as have all venues, over the last 18 months. And what Westminster Council have done, they say, we will scrap business rates for you. This is localism. This is the old Sustainable Communities Act back in the day. We will scrap business as long as you are doing the same thing, and your family, because it's the son of the original owner. As long as your family still owns the 100 Club, you won't have to pay business rates, because they recognise what that does for the surrounding areas. And for them, for Westminster Council, it's relatively small beer. For the area, it's massive. So it's that kind of innovation and disruption that I think is fantastic to hear.
So I think just picking up quickly on that sort of access to finance bit, and there's two different perspectives I want to get on this, and one is linked to a question that's come through online. Firstly, building on what you said, referencing the British Business Bank, and the question that we've had is around, obviously we have just gone through a period of time where businesses have been supported by the state in a way that we haven't seen for a very, very long time. Where, we obviously had the CBILS or Sybil's scheme supporting SMEs. Is there a way that something like that could be repurposed to support SMEs, to kind of get startups up and running as we go into this kind of period of economic growth? And could we adapt that in any way?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's two things that we've got. We've got the Recovery Loan Fund, which we've had to basically restart the economy, the successor of CBILS and the bounce back loans. The startup loan scheme, though, that the British Business Bank was originally founded to deliver in Maine, has still been going great guns since 2012, and so that's decent small loans for businesses coupled with a year's mentoring. So it's the wraparound service beyond around the finance that's there. What that has done, it's got some good figures on the kind of barriers that we were talking about. 40% of those loans have gone to women, 20% have gone to ethnic minority-led businesses. Now, clearly, that does not match up the percentages. 51% of women in this country, but nonetheless, it's still doing a lot better than your traditional banks. And so it's good that we can influence in that way.
Sure, and then the other perspective for you, Payal, is how do businesses get involved with the Centre for Inclusive Growth? How can people access that sort of private investment into
Yeah,
SMEs?
absolutely. Well, one of the things I wanted to share today, Angus, was that about 2 weeks ago, the Center for Inclusive Growth launched a program called Strive UK, which is a social impact program really focused on bolstering the resilience and growth of 650,000 British micro and small businesses. And what we're trying to solve for are kind of three macro things. One is the time poverty piece that I've now said probably 3 times. We're partnering with Enterprise Nation to create a data-powered kind of one-stop shop for micro and small businesses. I talked earlier about how fragmented the ecosystem is. So we want to make it really simple for micro and small businesses. So to put all of the different programs on one kind of in one database, and then using data science to help signpost the support programs that make most sense for them. And of course, because we're going to be using data science, we're going to be testing, learning, and iterating. So I think that's one way. The second thing that we're doing to really actually complement Help to Grow management is we're creating and curating a series of bite-sized video tutorials for micro and small businesses because we know not everyone has time to get the mini MBA. And so maybe in the commute, they can watch a 4-minute video on how to optimize customer relationship management. So that's kind of the first kind of bucket of things we're doing, and we're doing that with Digital Boost. We're also providing technology adoption support and one-on-one advisory services for micro and small businesses in collaboration with Digital Boost, because sometimes you just want to ask a question to somebody who knows what they're talking about. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, we've talked that there have been underserved segments of founders, minority ethnic founders, women founders. And so what we're doing with Be the Business is we're actually creating a very bespoke set of social impact programs for minority ethnic businesses, because we know that trust is a real issue. To the point that the minister made around peer mentoring, we know that sometimes minority ethnic founders are really skeptical about institutions, and they would much rather hear from an entrepreneur that is 2 years ahead of them in the journey, or to hear what experiences the entrepreneur that came before them had. And so we're really trying to work with local chambers of commerce to provide that support. And then the last thing we're doing, which I think is going to be really important for the ecosystem, is we know there's limited data about micro and small businesses. So what we're planning to do is to aggregate all of our programmatic data into a data lake. It'll of course be aggregated, and of course it'll be anonymized, and it'll be done very responsibly. But what we're hoping is that we're going to be able to glean really important insights from this massive data set, especially around minority ethnic founders, because we know there just isn't enough data to understand what they need. And then the last thing we're doing is we're actually creating a learning network of organizations that are supporting micro and small businesses. So from corporates to civil society institutions to academics, we're bringing them all together in something we're calling the Strive Learning Network. We already have 30 founding organizations, and the idea is to actually sit down and figure out not only how we collaborate, but how we co-innovate, because there's so many macro issues around, like, how could we use open banking to be able to open up access to finance? There are all of these fundamental things that none of us can do in isolation, and so we're hoping to kind of create a coalition that's really kind of focused on figuring out how we build back better for micro and small businesses. So a long answer to how organizations can get involved, but really not only through the Strive UK program, but in collaboration with our NGO partners, Be the Business, Digital Boost, and Enterprise Nation. There are going to be a lot of tools that we're creating, and we're also going to be amplifying the work of others, because I think that's where we're also going to make the most impact. So I'll stop there, but those are some of the ways.
So instead of scraping big data, we're going to be supping from the data lake. Is that what I like that thought.
I think you said about mentoring that it's about being able to ask questions to somebody who knows what they're talking about, which seems like a very good segue to allow our audience to ask questions to the three of you. So we have a roaming mic around, and straight up at the front here. If I've got a microphone down here, we'll do it anyway, so the people at home can hear.
It's all hybrid, yeah.
So I have just set up my own business in the last 6 months, and I actually kind of wish that I knew about this before, because I was spending so much of my time just trying to figure out what I should do. But one of the biggest issues that I had when I was actually setting up my business was that the fact that I was going to register my company out of my home, and that is part of the public record, and I didn't want that to happen. I'm also a counsellor. I don't put my public address all my personal details in a public forum in that way. So is there anything that could be done about that to help kind of remove a barrier to entry for people who don't want to share that information publicly? Because, you know, with what's happened, more and more people are setting up businesses out of their home premises.
I think there's a balance to be struck here, because actually one of the things that a lot of people have been calling for companies' house reform is to make sure the zombie companies don't get set up, and so, you know, with that privacy also comes an issue around the reliability of data. But from my experience when setting up businesses, I think you can actually keep your home, but the other thing you can also do is set your registered office up as a virtual address. It's a relatively small charge. I mean, we do have by far the lowest set up company formation charges in Europe, if not the developed world. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's 15 quid. It's 15 quid to set up a limited company, and to be fair, the 15 quid charge is, in my mind, in some ways too low, because we want to have ease of doing business, and we want to keep businesses low. But there are a lot of people that set up a lot of businesses. You know, not you that's just setting up your sole business. There's people that literally set up hundreds of shadow companies that never actually trade. So
you can also, through an accountant or a solicitor, they can have you as a registered address, but don't necessarily act as your secretariat as well. And some of them are quite happy to. They might charge you a little bit for setting up the company. No, I appreciate that. No, but I suppose for.
Yeah.
Oh no, completely. No, completely. But I think for those thinking about it, who might be listening at home or anybody in the audience. I was a solicitor, corporate solicitor in my time, and you can sometimes charge somebody maybe 100 quid to set up the business, make sure it's correct and proper, because sometimes you can be a little bit too quick on Companies House with some of these quick formation companies, and they will put the registered address down, but in effect not really do anything with it, but just hold it as a name. So that might be a possibility.
But there is actually a wider point that goes beyond that. Actually, it's about how do you give people really good advice right at the start of the journey, when they first think, I actually want to set up a business. Limited company might not be right for you in the first place, for example. And in Northern Ireland, when I was there, because the business support is devolved, they have a thing called Go For It.
Yep.
And it's developed by their enterprise agencies, delivered by their enterprise agencies. And I had mixed reports when I was there about the efficacy. In some areas it's better than others. But it was a 2-hour thing that someone would just basically call you, speak to you, say, right, where's your business plan? This is the kind of thing you need in a business plan. These are the kind of really fundamental basics that you need to know if you've got a business idea, but you have no clue about business. So it's a good stepping stone.
And presumably Mastercard, obviously, as part of your work, is giving that sort of advice and guidance to businesses as they're starting out as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're not only providing social capital in the form of informal corporate advisory boards, but we're also providing one-on-one free advisory services. So you can just say, how did you do it, right? Because to your point, you could spend hours on Google trying to figure it out, and sometimes it's just quicker to ask somebody.
Yeah,
absolutely. I see the question down here, please.
From the Isle of Wight Conservative Association. My fellow ethnic businessmen, they need as much help as possible because they can't even speak English, and they're cradle of small business. Most of my friends, they have corner shops, they do everything every day, work 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they have been doing that for the last 50 years, and they still haven't learned how to speak English. And for them, the technology is too complicated. So please give them as much help as you can, so that they can be happy to learn at their own pace, rather than be worried and scared how they're going to manage. Thank you.
So I think this goes to your point, doesn't it, Paul, about the barriers that businesses face, and
for sure,
lots of different barriers which are the same across lots of different sectors. But
absolutely. I'm half Burmese. My dad was born in Burma, and he came over with no money. And I always talk about the Asian equation. Basically, it's hard work, a good education, family network gives you the best chance of priority. See, there's any number of Asian countries and Asian diaspora that will follow that same sort of mantra. And actually, what you found is that first generation, second generation of immigrants naturally tend to be entrepreneurial. One, because you don't just ship up and turn up to the other side of the world unless you're family, unless you've got a sense of purpose. But people especially in the 70s and 80s and after some particular conflicts, they set up businesses partly because it was difficult to get a job. And there was a sense of racism and things like that was involved in that. So actually the only option for them to feed their family was to set up a business. But there are loads and loads and loads of people beyond that have actually set up some fantastic businesses for that entrepreneurial spirit. So yeah, we want to make sure that digitalisation can help you do that. And that's exactly what Help to Grow Digital and these kind of schemes are encouraging you to do. But we do want to break down those barriers. But the final thing I'll say on ethnic minority businesses is actually it's not binary. Clearly, Bangladeshi businesses, Pakistani businesses, and Indian businesses, Caribbean businesses, different parts of Africa businesses, and Middle East businesses, business people, all have very different cultural different needs and what have you that you really need to drill down to if you're going to start tackling those barriers.
I think our next question is right in the back corner there.
Thank you, Natasha Thomas from Sage. We're a Northeast tech company and really resonate with a lot of the points that the panel have made today. We'd love to welcome the Minister and Mayor to our new headquarters in the Northeast anytime, and also to perhaps partner up with Mastercard and some of that really exciting work you're doing, because there's a lot of synergy with things we're doing. So some of the points you made around access to finance, just a couple of insights. I think there's more we could do to unlock some of the barriers through digital innovation. For example, if small companies had a digital ID, this might simplify some of the problems that the lady over there is having in setting up her business. If we could have an open data platform for small business where companies like Sage and our competitors are sharing their data more easily with banks, then they can access more innovative forms of finance and cheaper finance. And then thirdly, we've done a lot of work in very deprived communities in Newcastle and London. 4 in 10 people have got an idea to start a business, but feel they lack confidence maybe to take that leap. The new enterprise allowance that the government has is worth about £1,200 in total. And we issued a report with the Entrepreneurs Network. If you quadrupled that, you'd hit the 5,000. So if you made it £100 a week for a year, £5,000 the average you need to start a business. So you could target that at the most deprived communities as part of the levelling up agenda.
Thanks. Payal, do you want to come in on some of the kind of open data platform and some of the work there that
Yeah, so I would just say, as we were designing Strive UK, we actually undertook a major stakeholder listening tour. So we spoke to, I think, over 70 different organizations and people and experts. And it's so interesting. One of the recommendations that came out very loudly was actually, we need to be able to share data more proactively. Of course, it has to be in a responsible, aggregated, anonymized way, but private sector needs to be able to do that so that we can better serve micro and small businesses. The other thing that hasn't come up in this conversation, but that I just add that came up in this listening tour, is that right now the imperative is on big business to think about sustainability and net zero. But sooner rather than later, micro and small businesses are going to be faced with this as well. And I don't think any of us have created the infrastructure to make it easy for a micro or small business to figure out how they're going to get to net zero. So I think another place where we can collaborate, in addition to, how can we responsibly share data? Because I think there's some trends that are coming faster than we're ready for.
Great, thanks very much. I think I've got another question just down the front here. We'll jump around the room.
Hello, Peter Walshdale, Buckingham Association. I also have a medium-sized bricks and mortar hospitality business, and I want to ask Paul if the Treasury understands the impact of pre-profit tax on growth businesses and how it impacts. Because if you think it through, we have the highest rate of VAT in tourism and hospitality in Western Europe. Business rates, which we hope are going to be fixed soon, really killing, particularly in the southeast. We've just had a double-digit increase in the cost of national insurance. Now, if you just take that last one, a relatively small one, a growth business spends the cash it generates on more growth. It doesn't distribute it to shareholders. Now, when you take a big lump of tax out of a growth business, it's not just a tax. it's borrowing capacity, so it's 4 times. So if the tax goes up by £250,000, it's £1 million that's not going to be spent in capital by the company. Yeah, and we've seen the obsession from the Treasury on pre-profit tax time and time again. Hammond did it, and we're having it again now. And you know, my key question is: do they get it, and what could you do to help them understand it?
I think the two taxes that you talk about, VAT and business rates, are two huge tax takes for the Treasury, and business rates in particular are quite a predictable tax for the Treasury as well. From memory, the support that we gave on business rates relief and the VAT cut has cost something, I think it was 26 billion quid a year for the VAT cut and 12 billion for the business rate. So that's the kind of scale that you're talking about, which you then need to replace. So, so the Treasury are the ones that look at holistically, as I say, at the tax system. So I know it's a big campaign that the hospitality sector have been pushing in terms of business rates and also that VAT cut, and I understand that.
But you can't grow.
Yeah, I totally get it. Yeah. No, it's, Peter, I mean, like, you know, you and I and other members of the hospitality sector have been talking about this for a long time. I do push this, make sure that the Treasury absolutely hear you.
So I think we had a question in the back. I'm conscious there's quite a few questions around. So if we can keep questions short, that'd be appreciated. Thank you.
Richard Bullock from Belfast. I'm an accountant. Most of my companies are my clients are Midlands manufacturing companies. My question is specifically around automation and also access to capital, which both of the MPs have alluded to. And what do the panel think they can do to help SMEs automate? A key issue for SMEs in comparison to a PLC is that if I want to put a robot in and I'm a well-capitalised PLC, I can easily fund that because they're funded my balance sheet. If I'm an SME and I want to put an automated production cell in and reshore a bit of manufacturing, the finance company can't get the residuals, so I can't get the access to finance, so I can't fund my automation, which a key thing for most of my SME clients is automation. I'm struggling to fund it. I know what I need to do. I've got the quote from the integrator in Birmingham who's designed my cell, but I can't fund it. So my key thing is, what do the panel think that the government could do to help support those guys access to finance for automation, because those are the sticky jobs in my view.
Ben, do you want to come in on this? I know you sort of talked around kind of the challenge
You've got a demotion, haven't you? Now you've been described as an MP.
No, it's fine. So we're looking at a lot of this on a local level, because then it's this, as I think I touched upon very early on, it's this strange schizophrenia between job creation and productivity. And through devolution, it's something you have more flexibility over. So at the moment, all of the business support funds are devolved through to us. We've got our own money that the government have given us in devolution that we're now helping to support SMEs. And we're looking at exactly that. We're not doing what was the old traditional, right, we can give you £10,000 for every job you create. That's fine, but like you say, how sticky is that in reality? But there's also, the ability to, rather than just continuously get into a grant culture as well. So being able to say to a business, well, okay, your finance doesn't quite stack up because, your return on investment for the financer means that you're not going to be able to buy the piece of machinery that you're talking about. We can take a much longer term view on these things. So there are loan arrangements in place. To a certain extent, depending on the size of the SME and what they're actually trying to invest in, there can be some small equity stakes that we could potentially look at taking on a devolved model. That then helps them introduce, it's in that ecosystem as well. So you're kind of saying, well, it's all very well and good having the money, but actually us being able to pay with another investor that we've been able to provide some money to that might be able to bring down the cost of capital to be able to invest in that piece of equipment is also all part of it. So I think actually what you might see, and it's one of the hopes that I've got for English devolution, if we can get devolution across the country, is I think what you'll start to see are competing models that appear across England, because, you might see Manchester come up with something, you might see, Buckinghamshire come up with a different idea of what they could do to support businesses, and then you'll end up seeing the public sector. Actually, what you'll see in proper English devolution is competition between regions and introducing competitiveness into the public sector that we're able to learn from each other. And I think we've got some really good innovative models around that. But at the moment, there aren't enough of us to be able to say that we've got all the solutions. So we've got some models, but it's not all of the answer that you're looking for.
Paul, is there anything you want to add on?
Well, I'd go back to the diversity. Interesting points that Ben was saying, and that would certainly start to lay that landscape, but also diversification of finance. So it's not just all about traditional lending.
Yep.
With people a bit more disruption and innovative approaches to that. Depending on what sector they're in as well. I mean, I was the aerospace. There's a fantastic Midlands Technology Centre where next to Meggitt in near Rugby, where they actually have additive manufacturing, big 3D printers that are fine for a company the size of Meggitt, for some of the smaller businesses in the supply chain, way out of their normal regime, to be able to try and test some of these sort of things. So you can go into the technology centre where they've got pretty well every brand of these big additive manufacturing bits of kit, which cost thousands. You can try it out and see which one you like better. So then you're reducing your research, reducing the cost of it. But then you need the finance, as you say, with that diversification. I think will help.
I think what you can also do is you can blend. So one of the things that we're looking at doing, and it's something strangely in the housing industry that Homes England have done effectively very, very well with the likes of Barclays and a couple of other lenders, where in effect they've got the private sector to put in X amount of money, and then the public sector can blend it to help decrease the exposure and the risk to them. And we're looking at that. So for exactly in your line where you're looking at, well, we need this new manufacturing piece of equipment to go into the factory, private sector lender's not going to do it. But if we were to put up as part of a loan a third of the cost, and they can take a view on the return on investment, then that's leveraging private sector money with the public sector and allowing for those things to get over the line. So, if they want to come to the Tees Valley and invest in that equipment, create some jobs, move a business there, more than happy to have the conversation.
Excellent. I think there's a question just over here.
Hi. I used to lead a small team of business advisors for one of the big four consulting firms in London. And for 2 or 3 years, we had a focus on SMEs and how we can actually get best practice to be duplicated from large company experience to small companies. And the biggest challenge, of course, was the ability to finance the advice. And so when they did get advice that we'd subsidized, they found it tremendously valuable. So one of the opportunities I would suggest would be to have some form of matching funding scheme whereby the SME could perhaps part fund the business advice, and for perhaps government to have a scheme whereby there could be some matching funding to help them to kickstart their growth and expansion requirements. Another, I'm now retired, but I still have the experience to be able to bring to the table at a fraction of the cost of the thousands of pounds per day that I would charge a large corporate. So there are opportunities, as we have an aging population of skilled people, to perhaps tap into that level of skill base at an affordable price for some of these SMEs. Just a suggestion.
And is that something that you're looking at, Payal?
Yeah, absolutely. We're certainly going to be looking and doing outreach in the community to see who can actually provide some of this advisory services to micro and small businesses. The other comment I'd make is one of the things that I'm really optimistic about, but of course no one entity can do it in isolation, is how we take and harness social capital and actually convert it into financial capital. So one of the things that I've been looking at in others jurisdictions is, as we're building peer mentoring, as we're building mentoring relationships, how do we use those relationships to actually de-risk micro and small businesses in the eyes of lenders? I do think there is going to be opportunity to use alternative data like this in the future to help unlock access to capital. I think we're still a little bit far from it. But again, I think if we figure out and get together and kind of co-innovate, there might be opportunity to take social capital and figure out how we actually harness it into financial capital.
I think for me, as entrepreneurial and optimistic as I like to think of myself as, the one issue that rings bells when you're talking about match funding for business advice like that is how government would perceive, in terms of value for money for the taxpayer, assure the quality of the advice. I know you give brilliant advice, but so which is why actually you mentioned Be the Business before.
Yes.
Did a load of work through Be the Business, which is funded largely through government, and you also mentioned Enterprise Nation again, do fantastic work. So it's how you would work that through the system. It's not insurmountable, but it's just that's something that we need to think about.
Who's looking around the room? Thanks. Question down the front here. Just wait for the mic.
Hi, I'm Kyle. I'm a counsellor for Ilkley, and I also work for Working Families. What I'm interested in terms of the backbone of local communities is how employers can be encouraged to move towards things like flexible working, because I know the government is just about to launch the consultation on flexible working. But if I give the example of a lady who I know in my community, who her employer lets her go and do the school run, comes back, but they're not under, there's nothing to make them or to encourage that to do it. That she has a good relationship. So in that kind of scenario, she's in a job because that opportunity gives her the chance to have childcare that she wouldn't otherwise do. She wasn't able to have that access to that part of childcare. She wouldn't have a job. She wouldn't be generating revenue for the Treasury. So is there a way the government, without breaking Ronnie's rule of nine words, being the government causing problems, helping to encourage employers to be able to offer that flexibility?
It's absolutely right at the heart of what we're looking to do. That consultation that you're talking about is talking about giving people the right to request, to accentuate the right to request, because it's not really, I don't think it's that feasible to have, for any number of reasons, because it's not suitable for every workplace and it can get quite messy otherwise. But the right to request flexible working from day one. And what does that mean? That means basically not just, as I say, working from home, but it can be job share, it can be flexi time, it can be compressed hours, annualised hours, phased retirement for older people, all of these kind of things that can then allow people to work around the school run, child care, and older care as well, which predominantly affects females over 50 that tend to be carers. And so what that does for the employer, it gives them a business benefit. It doesn't necessarily add costs as they might first of all think, because it means if you've invested in people in the first place, you don't want them leaving your business because they can't fit it around their childcare and the school run. That's ridiculous. So I had a panel in this very room earlier when there was someone talking about a particular retailer in his city, which was going through. They were just taking on 10 people, then losing 10 people, taking on 10 people, losing 10 people. You go through the town pretty damn quickly if you keep on going like that. It's just, you're spending more time recruiting than you are actually doing your core business. There's a real business impetus on that. But that consultation, and frankly, what the businesses will then have to do, they'll have to give a good reason why they're not doing it. If it really isn't suitable for a particular workplace, a particular role, then that's understandable. But if it's inappropriate and someone feels that's to their detriment, then clearly there's the tribunal system that they can do, and that who would then have to take notice of those reasons and see if they're actually, proper reasons or not.
And so one of the questions we've had through here as well is just around, and maybe this one part you'd like to kick us off with, but just thinking about, do you think there's this sort of tension between businesses, maybe some of whom are sort of wanting to switch digital, that's the growth area, versus local communities where maybe they're keen to retain their high street and retain kind of traditional businesses in that sense? And how can we try and forge ahead which is good for everyone and good for the economy and keeps the high streets thriving, but obviously keeps those businesses at the forefront of kind of economic growth as well?
Yeah, I think the unsurprising answer I'd give is that there's always going to be a balance between touch and tech. We are in an accelerated digital economy, but that doesn't mean that people don't want to go and get their coffee from their local coffee shop. And so I think the question is what consumers want, and there's going to be a need for choice, right? There's going to be, some consumers are going to want to do the Ocados, and some consumers are going to want to go to their local corner shop. And so I think for us, it's just how do we make sure that every micro and small business has the opportunity? It's up to them which path they want to take, but how do we make sure that they have the right opportunity to digitize if they want, but also understand how to stay as part of a local community. And I think what you're going to see actually is, while there is a digitization of micro and small businesses, people are still looking to buy local. It just might be that they buy local online and have it delivered to their home, and they just don't go in. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think we're just going to see a blend, but I don't think we're going to get to a place where we're entirely 100% digital, and I don't think we're going to get to a place where we're entirely 100% in person anymore.
I think there's two huge keys to the future of the high street, and first of all, that is understanding that high streets will change. They will shape, and there will be experiences, hence the hospitality ecosystem and other things like that, rather than just simply a destination for shopping. Secondly, why digitisation for small businesses is just as important, big businesses on the high street, is the absolute art is to have someone come in, feel the goods, touch, browse, whatever, and then if they want to go home, they are still buying from your site. It's that connection between physical and digital that actually, if you get it right, so hence it's what you said earlier about it's not just about software, it's how you apply it, is really key.
But do you think that requires a sort of a change in the businesses themselves and how that structure works? So if you've got a retail space, and again, this comes back to the business rates question, if you've got a retail space that you're paying for on a high street, which effectively becomes a catalogue that people go in and then they go and buy online, and that purchase might be, if you have multiple stores, might be registered in a different way. How should businesses be thinking about adapting to that to make sure that the money is staying kind of in the local region? And maybe this one for you, Ben, in terms of how we...
The businesses are all... I mean, there is already an adaptation to that. If you look at the consumer rules, there's a reason why, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you would have never bought a piece of clothing online and just guessed. Because you'd be worried I can't return it, it might not fit and all, it might not look good on me, whatever it might be. Whereas now, people actually are pretty relaxed, they'll buy it, they don't need to see it, they can have the return policy, they can send it back. A lot of the big retailers have caught on to that very, very well, realising they can transition to a distribution model rather than a retail model. So it's a major issue that needs to be addressed, and that's a problem for smaller retailers, because they're then having to compete in that pace where, I can go on Asda, I can go on, Debenhams, I can go and do whatever I want, and I can try my trousers on, realise that I've put on a bit of weight, need to send them back, need to size up, and it's just done. And that's largely driven, obviously, with the new relaxation in a positive way for consumers, because there are more consumer protections on the return rules around that, irrespective of fault or issue with the product itself. And that's a major issue that I don't think we're going to be able to square the circle of, because as we talk about this, let's also recognise that the reason we're in the position that we're in is that consumers are driving the way in which they purchase any product or interact with any service. And we've also got to be careful, while we need to make sure that there's a level playing field, we've got to make sure that we're not doing some sort of central planning, that this is the way that people have to interact with the business and this is how you have to interact with it. We as a government, we as a party shouldn't be there to dictate how people buy and sell goods. We should be there trying to create a fair environment that people can then interact with each other and come up with the innovation that allows that to happen. And if we're not too careful, we can potentially step over that line where we're actually inhibiting growth and inhibiting the setup of small businesses.
It goes back to what we said before about letting the market decide, really, isn't it?
Ultimately.
Best way to do it.
But again, it's the issue that you have in retail at the minute, because of the large digital companies, the likes of Amazon. Nobody said the word Amazon today so far.
I thought we were going to make it through.
It's the argument that, it's not unconservative to say that we need to do something about Amazon. We've got to create a level playing field, because at the moment, because the technology is moving on so quickly, and because Amazon, in effect, it's been a couple of decades really, but actually in the last 5-6 years with consumer behaviours changing, it's come out of nowhere in that shift. And as we've said, like the draconian way in which we have business rates isn't applicable to online platforms anymore. And so it's not about, like I say, we've got to just draw that line between managing the economy, making sure we can unleash the power of small businesses and startups, but not having a centralised management. But that's where the crux of the matter is. It's really the Amazon question, isn't it? It's how do you make an independent or an on-high street retailer competitive with Amazon that have a lower tax base because of the way that they structure their affairs. That's fundamentally the issue we have with our retail high streets, of which it's difficult to get an answer. It's great to have a global digital tax that obviously certain nations have signed up to, including the UK, which I think the government and Rishi have done a fantastic job to be able to do. But it's easy to get it over the line when it's actually lower than the rates that all of those countries are paying already, which you have to start somewhere, right? But ultimately, that's where the rubber's going to meet the road. And ultimately, there are going to be some difficult decisions for us to make if we want to rebalance the economy with Amazon and our actual in-physical retailers.
Sure. Just looking for other questions on there. Take one down here.
Really interesting debate. Thank you for today. So my name is Richard Jeffrey. I'm the National Director at the Growth Company just around the corner, and I set up the first Growth Hub, so I was delighted to hear you mention about the Growth Hubs in your session. The one thing I've seen where it works really well is where you've got private and public working really well together at a local level, getting those ecosystems really thriving and highly interconnected. So I'd like to understand from the panel and you'll all have a different perspective on it, but what you see as the key thing that we can do to get more local ecosystems working really, really well, and that private-public really coming together in a strong way. It works well here, it works well in some other places, but really interested to get your perspective on that.
Can I just quickly apologise? I need to nip out, if that's okay. So I'll be back. I've drank far too much water. I've been fidgeting in my seat for a long time.
No, we'll let
this
you
clock
step
is
out.
not going fast enough, so I have to go. I'll be back.
Thank you, Ben.
I hope it wasn't my question.
Paul, do you want to take this one first?
Yeah, so I've got two thoughts. I think it's a great question. First is we have to create a safe space to have dialogue. Having been in a lot of dialogue with either other private sector companies, civil society, academics, even government, if we had a more safe, curated space to actually say, here's what's working, here's what's not working, because I think we're all very reluctant, especially with major stakeholders, to say, here's where it's not working. I think that would be really important. The second thing is we have to do a better job. So yes, we can have a conversation within the local ecosystem, but we have to do a better job of cross-pollinating the learnings and the insights, right? Because I think an innovation that happens in one jurisdiction could be equally applicable in another, and there just isn't that forum to be able to cross-pollinate. So those are kind of two of my thoughts. We need to create a safe space, and we need to be able to cross-pollinate.
I think in terms of, it's interesting you talk about the Growth Hub, because I was just at a business lunch beforehand when we were hearing about one particular Growth Hub, not Manchester, where they had their website had 138 different places that they were signposting in alphabetical order. So not about what they were signposting or anything like that. So difficult. If that was me, I would have just switched off and gone and Googled it or something like that. It's just going back to basics. So it's like we were talking about the chap that was offering business advice. It's how can we work together? First of all, government needs to understand that we don't create jobs, we don't create wealth. We create the landscape and the ethos for businesses to do what they do best. It's drive footfall, understand their customers, and drive those free markets. But clearly, if we're going to be supporting businesses and supporting that kind of business advice, we need to have a sort of sense of quality control, because otherwise taxpayers would rightly be breathing down our necks on that. So it is a great sense of collaboration, as Payal said, with this, and that's why you're finding some really good examples in particular regions. But not in others. It's how do we get that consistency across the 38 growth hubs, across the business landscape in each of the devolved nations and England in turn.
There's a question down the front as well here.
Is there a way we can get universities and schools involved with small businesses? Because I think sometimes they're doing projects that maybe could be innovative from small businesses, could go into universities and actually be generated across there as a project. And also they have the machinery for 3D printers, all this sort of thing. We seem to be wasting our time but teaching them things that they don't really need to do, when it could be something in business that could be helping the local community and keeping the students there for jobs afterward.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, and actually there was amazing work that's been done in some universities around innovation, R&D, and any number of science in particular, startups that have spun out of academic research and practical academic research as well. But yes, there is a role to go wider than that, and so it's not always these big ticket scale ups and unicorns and the like that are there, but it's connecting students with an entrepreneurial outlook, which doesn't always happen in schools and universities clearly. But there is also another case to look at with some of this stuff about, and I think we touched on it earlier, about workers in general. Not everybody has to go to university. So what more can we do to feed entrepreneurship into schools at an earlier stage to show that there are different pathways, each to their own, and we need to support all of them.
Great. I think we've probably got time for one more question just here in the middle.
Thank you very much. Janice Sylvester. I'm a counsellor in Staffordshire, but also a former teacher, currently working in business, supporting small and medium-sized enterprises. And one of the things that I think Ben touched on earlier on in particular was, and also leading on from your question, is, from my perspective, the role of work experience as a possibility of trying to bring business and education providers, whether they're schools or colleges, even closer still. And it's to find out what you think that the role could be of work experience, if it is, and also how that can be encouraged in the private sector as well as the public sector, which I think has got some really good examples that we could look at the aspirations of young people in the public sector especially. Thank you.
Thank you. Ben, do you want to?
Yeah, of course. This is the problem with doing 3 back-to-back fringes without a break, so I apologise.
Well, we appreciate it.
No, it's a fundamental issue, and it comes down to that time poverty issue on the micro side. For the SME side, obviously we're going up to a couple of hundred employees. It's an important thing that can be done. I mean, I'll give you a couple of very quick examples that help not just from an entrepreneurial point of view, but help to inspire young people that make sure they go through their education journey. One was myself. You know, I was a slightly odd child at year 3. I picked up a random book off the shelf for reading hour. It was like a cartoon version of, it was called You Be the Judge Too, and I can still see the front cover. And it was a whole sequence of kind of like events where you had to say whether somebody was guilty or not guilty, or something right or wrong. And for whatever reason, it just captured my imagination. I thought I wanted to be a bit of a barrack room lawyer, which obviously then led me into politics because that's what we do. But ever since then, I knew from about the age of 7 or 8 that I wanted to go into law. I wanted to be in a courtroom. I wanted to be a barrister. And part of that, I think, certainly subconsciously, but probably to a certain extent consciously, helped me drive me through my education pathway. And I was also very fortunate that I had supportive parents. So basically, from the age of 9 or 10 or 11, it was just a given that I was going to go to university. It just wasn't a conversation for an alternative. At the other end of the scale, although my brother did go to university in a better university than I did, he ended up on a grad scheme at BAE Systems in the Northwest in Barrow on the nuclear sub-programme. And again, massive balance sheet. They can send their graduates out into local schools to put on demonstrations on robotics and various bits and pieces. And he's much more cynical than I and thought the whole thing was a waste of time. But then a couple of months later, he'd come home and say that he was speaking to a couple of the guys actually on the shop floor who were welders and electricians or engineers who still remember when that company went into their primary school when they were similar age to me, 7 or 8, and that's what they knew what they wanted to do. We've lost a sense of that because the economy's evolved, hasn't it? It's evolved into a much more individualistic economy. There's much more diversification, and it is the Teesside problem, right? It's the same thing across the country. You no longer have large employers that can put on that type of work experience. So how do you work with SMEs or micro businesses to allow them to expose their businesses to young people, to inspire them, but also how do you get them on to get them into the business to see whether that's something they want to do? Now, what I would say is, and I would genuinely encourage anybody interested in this, is to come and speak to us in the Tees Valley, because we did win a national award for the from the National Careers Service about what we've done in working with the National Careers Service and helping lift some of the burden from the micro businesses and small businesses, manage that relationship between certainly secondary education, because we haven't quite got the grasp of primary, so we're just trying to get it right with secondary, but matching employers and businesses with certain secondary schools, getting them to go in, do some days, trying to even encourage where they can, certainly probably with maybe FE level or sixth form students, to get them to go in for the day. So it doesn't have to necessarily be a week, it doesn't have to be 2 weeks. It's this idea, isn't there, that the Careers Service have, that 7 important interactions are the things that can define what you have and actually can define outputs from an earnings perspective. And what we've tried to hit are those Gatsby benchmarks, which we're doing extremely well in. So if you want to know the detail of what we're doing in the Tees Valley, it's something I'm actually personally very, very proud of. We'd be happy to share that with anybody who wants to know how you can interact with those micro businesses, alleviate some of that financial and time pressure that you would normally get with a big conglomerate that can do that and take the resource, but manage that public-private sector relationship that is going to be crucial going forward if we're going to support skills in the new economy.
Did you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, I'd just say I agree that it could be really time-consuming for a micro business, but I do wonder if there's an opportunity for universities and education systems to work with business representation organizations, because I think there you have a whole set of members who are micro and small businesses, but just as you were talking about that your government is leading on, maybe organizations that are representative organizations could play that role. So how do you make it really easy for the micro business, but also ensure that the students have the right exposure? So just some food for thought.
It's a really interesting point, because through some of the work that the DFE are doing, they've awarded contracts to a lot of the business representative organisation on the skills side. In the North East, it's the North East Chamber, it could be the CBI, the IOD. Yeah. It may be that that's an interaction that, as long as you've got the right representative organisation leading on it, that can also alleviate some of the business community from that. Exactly.
Great. I think we've obviously gone through the many challenges that small businesses face, but also the many opportunities and ways we can support them. And I think in terms of trying to answer that kind of the crux of the question behind tonight's event around how do we support small businesses and ensure that we're getting that economic growth in our local communities, it's skills and apprenticeships, it's mentoring, it's funding, it's financial support, it's regulatory, it's flexible working, it's those public-private partnerships, and of course it is those organisations like Centre for Inclusive Growth, like Be the Business. It's thinking about those clusters and hubs as well. And so there's, I think, lots of different ways that we can help to support businesses, and certainly we can all do our own part in supporting them on a kind of individual level as consumers as well. So thank you for this fantastic and engaging discussion. Thank you to Paul, Payal and to Ben, to Mastercard for sponsoring this evening, and to all of you for joining us. We hope to see you at a Conservative Home event very soon. So thank you all very much.